So I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Alanna Simpson. Sure. I will not go through the bios of each of the presenters because you all have on your chairs the bios of each presenter. So I'd like, in the interest of time, not to read them through.
I just wanted to extend my deep thank you to everyone who's contributed to organising this event here at the Tokyo Disaster Risk Management Hub. Also my fellow panellists, really appreciate you being here, and I look forward to listening to what you have to say. And thank you for everybody who's come, as Yuka said, in the rain to attend this session. And also I'd like to extend our thank you to the World Bank office in Jakarta who's joined us for this presentation. I want to speak today about how risk in our world is changing very, very rapidly. We know this from we look at how population growth has occurred very rapidly across the world, particularly in the last 50 years. And we see this played out in disasters when they occur, that the numbers of people being affected by disasters continues to grow. The picture is actually an image of San Francisco, both just after the San Francisco earthquake and as San Francisco exists today. But I like this image because it really does remind us how quickly our urban environments can change. From the devastation of the early 19th century earthquake to a vibrant San Francisco as it exists today. Many of you have seen graphs like this. We know that disaster losses are increasing in real terms year on, year out, and that we need to do something to avert this continuing trend in disaster losses. I always show this slide of a plaque on the side of a church in Manila. It tells a story about how this particular church in Manila had been destroyed 3 times in 1600, 1645, and 1863 by earthquakes, and I believe by a typhoon as well. This reminds us that these events have always been here, but then we look at the city of Manila as it exists today, and we can only imagine the potential tragedy of a similar earthquake today. The rate of urban growth is also quite astounding. There's a statistic that the equivalent of all urban infrastructure and housing built in the last 6,000 years will be rebuilt in the next 20 years. And when you think of very rapidly urbanizing countries like China, across South Asia and Africa, the statistic, while initially may seem very astounding, is actually quite plausible. And while this is quite frightening, it also offers us an opportunity today to change our future for tomorrow. And I really believe that we can change our future. This is an earthquake event that happened in 1931 in New Zealand. Both my grandparents survived this earthquake. In the case of my grandfather, only just as his school collapsed around him as a teenager. 80 years later, with the Christchurch event, the number of fatalities was substantially reduced because the New Zealand government had banned the type of construction unreinforced masonry. We know that that type of construction causes many fatalities in earthquakes globally. But because a decision 80 years ago made by the New Zealand government, when Christchurch occurred, the number of fatalities was much lower than it could have been. So we can change our future if we take a long-term view. Also, throughout the 19th century, cities in America burnt. There are a number of examples of where entire cities burnt. Rome built in 64 AD, and Tokyo indeed burnt in 1923. We don't see these large urban fires anymore. They're relegated to history. They're a historical feature that we hope never to see again. Why? Land use planning, prevention, establishment of fire services across the world, very sensible approaches reduced the impacts of these urban fires. And we can use many of these same approaches to reduce the impacts of disasters. So risk-informed decision-making is a very much a key recommendation of the Hyogo Framework for Action. And risk is a complicated term to define. It means different things to different people, but also from a scientific and an engineering perspective, difficult to construct. You have your hazard, it could be an earthquake, typhoon, your exposure, your urban environment, everything you value, your people, and how vulnerable they might be to an event. And you can calculate the risk as impact, number of fatalities, injuries, or the cost to government, business, and society. So risk assessments offer us a crystal ball that we don't have to wait until a disaster happens. We can see the potential impacts today and hopefully change our future. We were asked at the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery to compile the lessons learned, the experiences of institutions, governments, volunteers around the world, and compiling risk information over the last decade as a key input into the 2015 Global Assessment Report. So reaching out through the UN network, through the World Bank's networks, and through all of the different scientific networks, we compiled case studies from around the developing world of how risk assessments had been conducted, communicated, and used. And from that, we have a reference guide and a policy note which draws out the 10 key recommendations for the future. I'll go through these recommendations with some examples. One of the biggest lessons we've learned is how important it is to define what's the purpose of the risk assessment before it starts. It's too late to engage with the decision maker after a risk assessment has been completed. We need to have them on board at the start. But a risk assessment also for planning a risk reduction of bridges is inherently different from a risk assessment for preparedness. So we need to make sure we understand why we're producing risk information before we start, because the scale will be different, the amount of resources will be different. And we also really need to ask the question, if the end user had the information, how would they use it, and would they use it? We need to move away from very nice reports that get put on a shelf and don't get used. And here is an example of how scale matters. Global national resolution flood assessments are incredibly helpful for national level dialogue, but not very good for understanding, for instance, how flood may affect a bridge or transport infrastructure. That's where you need the high resolution flood modelling for cost-benefit analysis. So just from a resolution scale, it's very important to understand. We really need to make sure we know who's the owner of a risk assessment process, because risk information informs government decision-making or business decision-making. So it needs to be authoritative. People need to trust it. We need to engage local scientists in the process because they have knowledge that may not be published elsewhere. And we need to make sure the right agency who's commissioning the analysis is the right agency who will implement it. Often, for instance, we try and influence building code updates and construction in countries working with the scientific agencies, but it's not often the scientific agencies that has the mandate to update the building code. So therefore, it's very important that we're making sure we work with the right agencies. And is there a process to implement recommendations? If we work with the government around helping them understand how increasing their flood infrastructure, their safety levels, how much that would help reduce the risk, then we also need to help them get investment, funding to implement the recommendations that come out of a risk assessment, because a risk assessment is the start, not the end. And I articulate this here in a slightly different way, but we have many users of risk information, and we need to understand what their question is from the start. The third recommendation is around promoting the generation and use of open data. Anyone who's worked in a risk assessment in a developing country particularly knows that the data is very difficult to find and hard work goes into it. And often the data we need is not labelled how we need it. In this case, in Dhaka, this amazing data set of the built environment in Dhaka was on a CD in somebody's drawer when we engaged with them. Now this data is available to anybody who wants to use it to understand risk in Dhaka. We also found that there's a revolution going around the world called OpenStreetMap, where communities are being engaged to map their own communities. And in countries where a map doesn't exist, which is the reality of many of the developing countries, OpenStreetMap can form an amazing way to collect new data. In the case of Haiti, Haiti was mapped by volunteers in the weeks after disasters. There had never before been a map of Haiti. I give the example of Sri Lanka, where the government of Sri Lanka itself commissioned its own government officials to map vulnerable communities using OpenStreetMap. All of the buildings, all of the roads, all of the critical facilities. This is a great way of engaging with the community to understand their environment and generate the fundamental information needed to understand risk. Once we collect the data and we do the analysis, we need to be able to share the data so the next group who comes in who wants to update the data, use it for a different purpose, can quickly access it. And so we have been working for almost 5 years on an open source geospatial platform that allows governments to share their data on disaster risk management. And this has been used post-disaster, in the case of Typhoon Haiyan, to bring together all of the different data that was being produced in the aftermath of Haiyan, from satellite imagery to reports of people in the field, into one place. And in this case, you can see where volunteers using OpenStreetMap undertook damage assessments. And here's some examples of GeoNodes, so these open source GeoNode platforms that GFDRR and the World Bank have been supporting around the world. Platforms where governments can share data with each other, with their citizens, with the private sector. The fourth recommendation is around making the communication of risk information an urgent priority. Terms such as annual average loss might be very interesting from an insurance perspective and a financial perspective, but for communities on the ground, annual average loss doesn't mean anything. Please tell us what a disaster might look like in my community. And this is where Pak Irwan from Indonesia will speak to a program where the Indonesian government worked in partnership with the Australian government, GFDRR and the World Bank to develop a simple tool which actually enabled decision makers to ask questions and get answers. Ask questions that a decision maker at a city level may actually ask, like, in the event of a flood, how many hospitals might be closed? These are real questions that decision makers ask. And in this case, this tool combines very robust analytical processes with local data to give an answer. And this tool is open source, so across the world, other governments are starting to get very interested in using this tool. In this case, the government of Sri Lanka is intersecting tsunami information with building information. So which buildings would be inundated by a tsunami event? Which hospitals and critical facilities are most at risk? The fifth recommendation is around fostering multidisciplinary, multi-institutional and multi-sectorial collaboration. Anyone who's worked in a risk assessment knows that all of the information doesn't exist in one place. One agency will never have all the information. So you need to build the partnerships with different groups of people who can work together. And I give the example, these are just some examples, there's many more, of the C-SCAND agencies in the Philippines. The C-SCAND agencies is a group of government agencies with the mandate to understand the risks from disasters, and they work together. From the Meteorological Agency to the Geological and Volcanological Agency to the Spatial Planning Agency to the Emergency Management Authority. Because not one agency can do it alone. And we also need to reach out and recognise that the private sector is doing risk assessments, non-government organisations are doing risk assessment, and we can work together. And I give this example of simply exposure, our environment, the types of data required to understand exposure. And I can't speak to the Japan experience, but I know from New Zealand and Australia, all of this data would be spread across many different agencies. So the need to build collaboration is fairly obvious. There is a need to consider multi-risk assessments instead of looking at one hazard in isolation. Very rarely does any decision maker just have to work with one hazard. Communities often face multiple hazards. There's also a risk of maladaptation, for instance, if you don't consider multi-risks. Up on the left is a building in Haiti. Buildings in Haiti, which is affected very frequently by typhoons or hurricanes, were built to be made of very thick concrete to withstand the winds. But these same very thick concrete buildings actually collapsed and killed the residents in the earthquake. Similarly, in Christchurch, a failure to consider the groundwater conditions and the water conditions under Christchurch meant that liquefaction created a lot of damage from the Christchurch earthquake. So these types of natural hazards, all sort of, if you don't consider them all, you risk creating a system that effectively could create additional hazards for your population. Keep abreast of evolving risk. Risk is changing everywhere. Risk is changing from climate change. In this example here, this is looking at the loss in the Pacific countries, the cost of disasters in Pacific countries as the typhoon or in the Pacific cyclone tracks move further south. So you see in countries further to the south, their loss or potential loss from cyclones will be much more, whereas in countries to the north, they may have reduced loss as the cyclones generally move south. The other example I'd like to give is really the influence of urbanisation, unplanned urbanisation and rapid urbanisation in one city, this is Kathmandu, and what it does to the risk and the opportunity we have today. So the graph here is showing increased population growth, census growth in Kathmandu, and you can see from the picture, possibly better on that screen or one of the others, how the urban environment is perhaps the building code is not very well enforced. So we can model this potential risk in Kathmandu to the point that by about 2015, an earthquake which in 1934 was devastating, the Bihar earthquake, that same earthquake by 2015 is likely to destroy over 100,000 buildings in Kathmandu. This is a tragedy of terrible proportions. But the risk is increasing at a very rapid rate as there's increased densification, so more buildings being built and buildings are going up higher and higher. But we have an opportunity because we have predicted risk, but it's not predetermined. The buildings haven't been built yet. So this is our opportunity. What if all new construction in Kathmandu was better designed for earthquakes? How does that change our risk? Well, you could have a 20% reduction in 15 years of earthquake risk in Kathmandu. So we have an opportunity today to change the risks that our children and grandchildren have. The recommendation 9 is ensuring that risk information is credible and transparent. The example here is actually Japan and a ground motion map for Japan. This is not a real one. It's just an example of where one element of the risk model was changed. In this case, the ground motion prediction equation. It's just one element, but you get a very different map. And unless you have the scientists in the country who really understand why a decision is made, you really run the risk of giving erroneous information or not the best information. And also we need to record this. So if someone picks up this map 10 years from now, they understand what the decisions were that produced that map. So we can understand. We really need to understand and communicate the limitations of our risk assessments, particularly in developing countries where the data gaps are so great. In this example, we're looking at the difference on the bottom of digital elevation data, the shape of the Earth, and the impact that that has on tsunami maps in Indonesia. And if you see on the far right, where the data being used is what's known as SRTM 90 data, the tsunami wave doesn't make it onshore, which we know from historical events that tsunami wave has come onshore. So again, you could give very misleading and erroneous information. We also know that sometimes our measurements aren't the best. Here we have river water levels that change quite rapidly, but the standard observation times miss the peak water levels. So therefore your flood map, if produced of this, if you didn't understand, could be again erroneous. We also need to be aware of unintentional messages that we might portray by using solid lines on maps. As scientists, we understand that a line isn't really a line and there's a lot of uncertainty. But for somebody building in a local community who's building a school, may think that above that yellow line, it's safe, right beside that yellow line. So we need to be very careful about the use of solid lines on maps or giving out very precise numbers, because when people see very precise numbers, again, they may think that it's 100% accurate, when we know that it's not the case. So these are unintentional messages we need to be very careful of. And we need to continue to encourage innovations in open source software. In the last decade, there has been a revolution in open source software. Many of you in the room might be familiar with HECRAS, which was a wonderful, freely available flood model made by the US government many years ago and has been used around the world. Now, there are many, many flood models in existence around the world. You know, here's a short view. Now, not all of these are appropriate for different use. Some are in some situations and some aren't in others. But by enabling innovation, we are giving more options to our scientists, more options to our decision makers. And then we did our own crowdsourcing of people in the global understanding risk community as what did they think describe best practice risk information. And here's a word cloud. Local features very prominently. People want to understand their local risks and know that their local information is incorporated, their local knowledge. Trust came up very authoritative, targeted. Investment. I think there's nothing sadder than providing a decision maker with excellent information on their risk, but no way to follow it up with investment and risk reduction, for instance. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lana. I just wanted to briefly summarize the 4 key points that Lana was trying to make. One is that risk assessment is a process. We have to look at it from a multi-hazard perspective. We have to look at it from a multidisciplinary perspective. And we always have to be mindful that it's uncertain. When we predict nothing, you can never give precise numbers because it's still uncertain because it's based on uncertain modeling, uncertain data. And then third message that she said was we need to be able to communicate clearly what we are trying to get across to the public. We have to be sure that we are careful when we give the data so that it doesn't cause unnecessary panic or unnecessary confusion. And fourth is the importance of open source data and software, that everyone has access to it from the local level to the government level, and the need for collaboration between different institutions. So thank you, Lana.